Looking at our analysis of the labor market equilibrium so far, it assumes that markets adjust instantaneously, or at least very quickly, to shifts in either supply or demand curves. So the wages and employment change just as swiftly from the old equilibrium levels to the new equilibrium levels. Now, one of the reasons that I included that reading from Hayek was not to punish you with dense German writing. Instead, was so that the idea of the constant churn and the slow adjustment towards equilibrium was in the back of your mind while we went through these models and how markets shift towards equilibrium. It turns out that many labor markets do not adjust so quickly to shifts in the underlying supply and demand curves. The market for engineers is a great example, but any highly skilled profession that requires a lot of education for you to do upfront before you can enter the field will experience these sorts of fluctuations like this. So engineers are a highly skilled profession where we see a systematic periods of boom and bust that kind of, belay the notion that labor markets attain competitive equilibrium quickly and cheaply. So you may be tempted to think that this is the case, that this sort of disproves or this throws out the model of labor market equilibrium. Now, remember in the weekly answer video, module two, so looking back on module one, when I said that people can act economically rationally, but it turns out that they're wrong, that there's nothing in our models that says they can't be wrong. Well, that helps explain what's going on here, that they're looking forward, they're projecting what the wages and then the employability is going to be in engineering, but they can't predict the future perfectly. And that's where these issues come from and what causes the sort of boom and bust cycle. Um, so let's just think of a recent example. If you remember the learn to code meme that like several years ago, there's a big push to get young people to go into STEM and for people to, re-educate themselves, learn how to code and change careers. And there's a real focus not just on STEM in general, but a focus on like tech jobs. But not even a few years later, not only are tech firms not hiring for the past year, they've been actively laying off staff. So those students who in many cases needed to complete 4 years of schooling before they could work, entered school making what seemed like a wise choice, going in, getting a safe, high-paying job with in-demand skills. But by the time they graduated, there were already too many potential workers and far more than what firms needed. We'll see this story is basically what happens with engineering, but we'll walk through a supply and demand model to see exactly how this works. So, walking through this example, there are two key assumptions that underlie the typical model that's used to illustrate how these trends in the entry wage can arise. So, the first assumption here that kind of explains what's happening is that it takes time to produce a new engineer. And the second assumption is that people decide whether or not to become engineers by looking at the conditions in the engineering labor market at the time they enter school. So they're looking, 4 years into the future, trying to project what it's going to be like based on what the conditions are like now. Most people just assume that the conditions like now are going to continue, at least in general. Maybe not exactly, but if it's an in-demand industry now, they think it's safe to assume it'll be an in-demand industry within 4 years. So right here, we have the start of the market. We have the supply curve here, upward sloping. We have the demand curve here, D, downward sloping. So the initial wage is at W0, and the employment level is at employment zero, or E0. So when the demand for engineers increases, the labor demand curve, so basically the number of, that represents the firm's demand for workers, that shifts out from D to D prime here. So moving out here, the new place it crosses right here is at E star. That's the employment level of engineers. And the wage is W star right here. But there's an issue. It takes 4 years to make a new engineer. So we end up trapped at this employment level E0 where we were before. So what we have to do is trace up that employment level, which cannot change in the short term, does not change because, there's not enough time in the short term to get new engineers to enter the labor market. So it's right here where it crosses the demand curve. Here at W1, this really high wage above the equilibrium wage, or what would be the equilibrium wage, that's what firms are willing to pay to this number of engineers. Now, this is great for engineers, but there's still an issue. Firms want to hire E star, this many engineers. They want to be down here, so paying less and hiring more. But there just aren't enough engineers yet. But W1 is a good wage. And knowing that firms need engineers, a lot of incoming students choose to become engineers. They see these high wages up here, this W1, and they see that they may not see, the supply and demand curves, but you can tell when there is a relative shortage, when firms want to hire more workers in a particular field. Very few people lose their job, wages rise, they get non-wage perks. Firms do whatever they can to try to recruit more people into the profession. So it makes it very clear to people that this is a good profession to go after. So if we look at the wage W1, what happens in the next period as we look at the people making decisions as they're going to school is that W1, that high wage is consistent with this point on the supply curve out here. That is equal to E1 number of employees. So that's more employees than firms would want to hire in equilibrium. So we end up with firms, if there are E1 workers, which is what we have now because the new engineers enter the labor market, firms are willing to hire that many only at this lower wage. So down here, that falls to W2, below not just the wage they were just paying, but also below the equilibrium wage. So going on, your textbook just has this one curve. I wanted to break it down a little bit to make it easier for you to see. But the story doesn't stop there. We get the wage at W2. At that point, wages are lower than equilibrium. We have that lower level of employment, so you only end up with E2 engineers coming in the next period because of that lower wage. Well, at that point, at that wage, firms are willing to hire more at this employment level. They're willing to pay more so they could get wage W3. In the next period, that draws in however many trace across W3 to the supply curve up here. You would trace that down here to an employment level between E1 and E star. So what we see is slowly over time, we're getting too many workers. And then once the workers in that field, in this case, the engineers, see that there aren't, the wages aren't high enough, that there's not as much job security as they thought, fewer enter in the next period, they end up below the equilibrium wage. And it keeps going on and on. Now, something you might be wondering is why didn't we see the supply or demand curves shift when we had these, this movement towards equilibrium, this slow process? The reason that happened is because these issues were caused between a mismatch in supply and demand. And in each period, supply isn't adjusting. It can only adjust we're thinking of this in terms of 4 years, or thinking of it as every year where new students are looking at the labor market outcomes, but it's solid. I can't go and just start practicing as an engineer. Because you need that education to get in there. The supply curve ends up not shifting, and the demand curve isn't shifting. The underlying dynamics that causes a firm to want to increase their demand curve or to decrease their demand curve, none of these things are changing. It's just a slow process caused by this mismatch where they're adjusting towards equilibrium, going past, adjusting again, slowly and steadily getting there. It's just showing that the market adjusts, but it's doing so imperfectly.